A few months ago, we said goodbye to the Volumetric series. Well, it's back. And Backstreet's back. Yes, that's right, Volumetrics are back, and for a few reasons. One, there were quite a few people asking how to apply the same idea to robes and cloth, and honestly, I kind of just got sick of typing the response being, do the exact same thing, follow the shapes, not the material. And two, there was a grave misunderstanding about the idea of directional light, and some being confused with how to continue that on the back of the model. Some are seeing the idea as a singular spotlight and not taking into account the ambient light that bounces and reflects off everything and will illuminate the back. Not quite to the same intensity, but it's there all the same. And that's actually where this idea came from. What if we did paint it like a spotlight? Not OSL, nothing's glowing and mystical and magical, but an actual spotlight, just like on the stage.
To set up this idea, it's airbrush time, and there's going to be very minimal movement here. Because the concept is a singular light from a singular direction, that's really what we're going to try and push around. But because paint doesn't quite bounce like light does, there is going to be a little bit just so I can hit everything that we need to on that side. Leaving the other side completely blacked out. One simple step and you can already see the incredibly heavy contrast as well as where basically everything's going to sit for our light. And what I'm doing now is purely for demonstration purposes. With a little bit of matte white paint, all I'm doing is going around and picking out the hardest, sharpest details that would also be picking up the hardest, sharpest light. Even though this is an incredibly useful exercise for a little bit more insight on contrast, light placement, and intensity, I cannot stress enough that you don't have to do this for every model. Once or twice is more than enough to give you an idea of placement. Also, metallic details, even if they're in the dark, are going to reflect hard light.
With an idea of where our light is coming from and where all the shadows are going to be, let's do this again, with colour.
Don't worry, I absolutely did take a reference photo before we came back in and reprimed. You don't have to do this, I just like to. But after that, we're coming in with, guess what? Terrestrial Titan. And even though next to the black it looks pretty bright, this is going to be our deepest, darkest shadow tone. It also takes the intensity away from the black for when we build up the colour, like right now. To start building up our colours, we're going to take Diabolic Plum and Terrestrial Titan and make somewhat of a 50-50 mix. That just means a colour between the other two colours that we used. And that little clear drop, that's just airbrush medium. Just helps out that flow. For application, this is just standard layering. But for placement, this is why we went through that whole ordeal to kind of set up that light placement reference. Running with this idea, the light is roughly coming from around where the staff is, so we're going to point all the colour towards that. But here's the magic, for the first layer, we're actually going to add the colour in on the opposite side as well, even though that should be our deepest, darkest shadow because it was all blacked out after our light reference. This will help out more than you think.
Even if they come from the same range, not all paints are equal. And in this case, a lot of pinks and purples tend to be on the thinner side of things. If you're expecting every paint to behave in the same way, this is going to feel like a flaw, but if you get used to the properties of each paint, colour and range, this is a feature.
Stepping up into the next layer, which is just pure Diabolic Plum, I thinned it down just a little further than we would for a typical layer. There's still enough pigment in the mix that every brush stroke is going to noticeably add in colour, but it's going to be a little more transparent. And the entire reason for this is that it's going to actually help out with blending. Because the colour is a little more transparent than usual, it means that the previous layer is going to show through just a little bit more than it typically would. And even though it looks like a big bold jump and step up in colour, it's actually going to dry a little duller than you'd expect. The cool part to this is it's kind of auto blending. We are going to come in with a second layer of this colour just to build up that opacity, but it's still going to be creating its own transition between the two. And even though here we've stepped up again by adding a little bit of Wicked Pink into that Diabolic Plum, we're going to be continuing on with this idea. Every step and layer is going to be thinner and is basically going to blend everything in for us. But real quick, let's talk about the placement of those blends. The ripples in these sleeves I'm treating kind of like waves. After building up the gradient of colour as it kind of approaches the peak, that ripple and fold is where we're going to have a pretty hard drop off back into that deep dark recessed colour. Even though all of these shapes together create one section, we're still treating each shape as an individual shape. And really, that's the key to volumetric highlighting. The shapes already give us a top and bottom.
The simplest way to represent light and shadow is with contrast from light to dark. Darker colours in the shadows where they're not getting as much light, and lighter and brighter colours in the parts that are exposed to more light. It's nice, it's easy, it does exactly what we need it to. But we can add an extra layer to this. By adding something like an ice yellow to make it lighter and brighter, it's also going to shift it towards feeling like a warm light. And that's exactly what we're going to do.
After building up in our mixes all the way up into a pure wicked pink, we're going to start to mix it down with a little bit of ice yellow. And the reason that I picked ice yellow is because it's warm. We want that warm light feeling. You can take this exact same idea and same process and swap out the ice yellow for something like a really pale blue, and you'll get a cool light. The application here does not change, it's still purely just layering. And the idea of placement also doesn't really change, we're still basically building all the way up onto the peaks of all of these shapes. But where it does differ a little bit is now we're dealing with intensity. Because the light is being imagined as coming in from roughly the direction of where the staff's pointing, that's where we're going to build up this intensity. The light's getting stronger. This part is actually a little bit more OSL. The only difference is instead of a big, bright, mystical, magical, glowing object, we're playing a little bit more into the hand of a natural light. But the same rules apply. The closer you get to the light source, the brighter you go with your highlighting. This is also where we roughly start to cut out a few sections as well. If we continued to paint every single part to the same intensity, you wouldn't get the feeling that the light was coming from a particular direction. Since the physical left side of the model is going to be closer to the light, that's where we're kind of building into. And as we add more ice yellow into that mix, we're basically just going to start to focus a little closer to that direction. For context, compare the brightness of each arm, they're fairly drastic.
Alright, look, I get that there are very few people that are going to spray down some kind of directional zenithal, take a photo, and then use that as a light reference. In real life, for most things, I don't do it either. But since it's here, we have it, let's use it.
When comparing to the reference photo, we were 90% of the way there. There's just a few little sections that we could probably build up to match. If you keep all those mixes on your wet palette separately, this is where you can use them to come back and adjust to where you need. Another key aspect is to remember the difference between imitation and animation. If you feel the model needs some more color that's not in the reference, do it anyway.
The miniature that we're painting in this video is from Warcrow by Corvus Belli as part of their new release for Mounthaven. Yes, I have been pronouncing it Mounthaven. 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 I'm calling this Mounthaven. The action pack comes with 10 models, so you'll see more of those on the channel, as well as character cards with names like this guy's who I can't pronounce, and a multi-faction, multi-scenario narrative campaign. Pre-orders go live from the 5th to the 26th of March, with stores getting their copies April 24. And there's a link in the description.
Alright, we're changing up colours, we're changing up details, but we're not changing ideas. For all the little trimmy trim on Mr. Fancy Pants' robes, we're starting out with Scarab Green. And we're just going to line up everything with it. This is our deepest darkest. After that, for our first highlight, we're coming in with Deep Azure. At this point, I've had these paints for years now, and Deep Azure is still fun to say. Azure. As far as placement goes, we're using the exact same idea, so all the places that we can kind of follow along where all the light is hitting and where the intensity is, that's where we're highlighting. For this, you can either use the reference photos or just follow that light pattern that we've already painted in. And just like shingles on a roof, moving up into our brighter highlight, which is actually just pure Deep Azure, it's the same deal. Covering the same area, but just a little bit less so that previous color shows through, and then we build up a gradient between that dark to light. And for that last little bit of sparkle, I mix in a little bit of marine mist into that Deep Azure, just to pick out some of the brighter spots. This is really just an accent color, so I'm not going insanely intense with this one. Just enough to look good.
I suck at painting beards, it is a fact of life, but this means that I actually had to put some effort into it and figure out a way of how I was going to approach it. I had an idea, and spoilers, it worked.
Okay, the two main colors that I'm using here are the Darkness and Grey Castle. It does go back and forth with mixes and wet blends a little bit, so step by step, do what you want. But the general idea is I kind of want to start sketching in where I want the light to be. In this case, we're still following that same directional idea, so it's going to be pointed directly at the face. Everything that's on the face and pointing that way towards the staff, that's where the brightness is coming. And even though currently it looks like he was on the working side of a glory hole, this is just sketching in where we want those light placements to be. Again, there's a lot of back and forth with just adding Grey Castle, building it back into the darkness, kind of going back and forth. Right now, this very moment, I am completely 100% ignoring the details. All I'm looking to do here is build up volume and placement. Even though it's pretty rough at the moment, it should actually give you a fairly good idea if you squint your eyes to make sure everything's in the right spot.
With all the basic shadow and light ideas now, it's just a matter of refining. And as much as this is still basically just highlighting and building up color, this approach, this is actually where the details are coming in.
After building all those volumes up, we have a good idea where the shadows are sitting, where the light placements are sitting, and this is just pure detail work. All of this underpainting was just preparation for kind of building up tones underneath. Mixing a little bit of sky shard into that grey castle, we're really just picking out each and every single individual strand. As we do that, you'll notice that the details will actually start to pop in the beard, and that the shadows in between each and every single strand, but for the different sections, they're going to kind of somewhat undulate. Which means they'll be brighter in some sections, darker in others, and just have a nice little bit of a flow through. For paint consistency here, you do want to thin it down, but you don't want to thin it down too much. We need a lot of control. If the paint's too thin or your brush is overloaded, it's going to start flowing into the recesses, and we're going to lose all of that undulating shadow. And yes, undulating is just as fun to say as azure. And to be honest, I don't even care if I'm using the wrong word. Undulating. Moving into pure sky shard, we're going to continue this same idea of detail highlighting and mostly starting to push this again towards the intensity and direction of the light. And since we've been playing with all of those different tones going through cold shadows into somewhat warm-ish shadows or kind of mid-tones, and then back into a cool tone for the highlight, it's going to bring out a silver fox, almost platinum kind of beard. It's fresh, it's clean, it's shiny, he should be on a shampoo commercial. Then just keep building up those highlights until you're happy. Sorted.
So this is the exact same non-metallic metal gold recipe that I use for basically everything. But instead of being so dramatic with contrast and variation, I had a slightly different idea, and that needs some practice.
Never underestimate the potential for failure when you're trying something new. Even though I paint non-metallic metal gold with these exact same colors almost every single day, there is the potential for failure. Especially when the concept here is not something that I typically do. And that's because this time we're still pushing towards that directional light. And on something like a metallic surface, it's going to reflect pretty hard. Which means we need to shift everything towards that direction. Usually I like some big variation between getting some deep dark tones, getting a lot of the mid-tone, and then some incredibly bright highlights with my non-metallic metal gold. But this time around, what I was basically doing was pulling a gradient across the whole thing. And my actual concern here was that it was going to feel like a gradient instead of feeling like non-metallic metal. So in the end, what I ended up doing was still pulling that same gradient, but then creating a bounce slide on the opposite side. Remember the beginning of the video, even the metallic parts that are in the darkness are still going to be reflecting light, so I played off that idea a little bit as well. And then for the main highlight, I pushed brighter and brighter until we got all the way up into pure ice yellow.
Obviously, slightly biased opinion here, but that worked. And now all we have to do is repeat this on a bigger section with more details. This could very quickly turn into that didn't work.
Just because I had one success does not mean that I was brimming with confidence here. In saying that, getting a little warm up for some practice, it did help a lot. With all the details on this super shiny waist trainer, we kind of had to combine both ideas. The first idea, of course, being what we were doing already with the non-metallic metal gold, but the second is what we were doing with the robe originally. We have one idea, one direction, but we're also still going to be treating each and every single little detail as its own shape. But this time they're just going to be kind of shapes that all work together. The big part that I thought was actually going to be the make or break of this section was what happens on the other side, the side that should be cloaked in darkness. Well, we found out before from what we were doing with everything else that it still needed to have a little bit of light because it's a reflective material, but it wasn't in the direct path of that original intensity from the light's direction. Long story short, I basically built up the exact same thing, but didn't go to the highest highlight on that side.
I know it's late in the video and we've already done an ad thing, but in-game's Army Painter, Heresy 5. Yeah.
As far as the application goes, all of this is still the half-step basic bitch blending. Creating 50-50 mixes of our next layer, as well as thinning it down a little bit so the previous layer shows through, and just repeating that same idea. This is a fairly solid basis for a little bit more unrefined work. As far as trying to place it somewhere in that effort to outcome quality scale, this is probably as high as I go before starting to look at going into actual display level. This is something I'd probably put around tabletop +++. That's not the most important bit of information, but at least it does give you some kind of idea as to the effort that was put into it. I think this model was around 6 or 7 hours. And if you did that fucking arm thing when I just said 6-7, we're gonna have a problem. Because this is a little bit bigger of a section than those little bead beads, there was more room to add more contrast. And because of how I usually paint non-metallic metal gold, my lizard brain really wanted to take that contrast a little further. This is where we really had to try to stick with that same idea though. This is not trusting the process, this is more ignoring the little voices. The midtone is taking up a greater amount of space than what I would typically do with non-metallic metal gold, but honestly, it's probably why it looks better than my usual non-metallic metal gold. I'm a little mad about that.
Alright, I need you to understand how big of a deal this is. We are about to make history, something that no YouTube mini painter has ever done before. We're painting the back.
Because this is an idea all based around a spotlight, there is going to be a lot of shadowed area. Honestly, for the front, I probably took the color a little bit too far, but that was also showing how ambient light works. So the big question is, how do we pull off the effect while still adding color and not just leaving the back black? And the answer? Just add the fucking color. We're going to take the exact same steps as we were doing before. The only difference here is going to be two things. And they're actually kind of related. Not like an Alabama Uncle Dad kind of situation, but you'll see what I mean. We're going to take all of those same mixes and use the same steps building up into the same tones. But what we're going to be doing here is, instead of building up with those half layers, we're still going to do that. What we're actually not doing is adding the second layer for opacity. That basic bleach blending, because we are using transparency to somewhat help blend us through, that's also going to do the same here is if we don't build it to the opacity. Because it's translucent, it's going to bring up more of the color underneath. So if we're only going layer by layer by layer, instead of adding more on top of each other of the same color, we're actually going to start to darken and desaturate everything down. And then we're going to follow that exact same light placement through the exact same channels. All the colors that you're seeing on the back here are the exact same colors and mixes that we were using on the front. The only big thing that you'll notice as a difference is they're not as bright. And all of those mixes stop before we get to the pure midtone. The turquoise is the scarab green to deep azure, and it stops before getting to pure deep azure. And the purple is the terrestrial titan to diabolic plum before we get to pure diabolic plum. We don't need insane levels of detail and coverage here, we just need the inference of color and light. And then to smooth everything back and kind of blend it all together for the darkness, I went back in with some of the base tones as a glaze and pulled them all back down. Honestly, I think we're about ready to call it. Believe it or not, yeah, this was all still basic volumetric work. No matter the material of what we're working with or trying to represent, you can take these same ideas and apply it in the same way. Because all we're really paying attention to is the shape. As always, a massive thank you to InGames the Army Painter and the best Patreon members in the world. And for this one, Corvus Belly. Big love, you filthy heretics.